The Demon's Rapture, Chapter 1. Raymond awoke. The hospital room was empty and dark. Too empty, too dark. It was daytime, he could tell from the lines of sunshine through the shades across his window. But something wasn't right about this sunshine. Something that made Raymond feel like it wasn't the sun at all. As if something was blocking it. Something that wasn't letting the sun do its job. He closed his eyes and shuffled through his last few memories, which felt something like dreams. He could remember the hospital, but why was he there? All he had to reference was the faded memory of his pickup truck, the steering wheel to be exact. He remembered gripping it tight as he braced himself for impact. He remembered how his teeth had rattled inside his head. Yes, the car accident. It could have been worse. It had left him with only a concussion and some tightness in his back. He was on his way out of town when a car slammed into him through a red light, operated by a driver whom Raymond was quite sure was already dead before the collision. He couldn't remember much from there, but he remembered why he was speeding out of town. That morning Jesus Christ had appeared before him in his dream, although it was the most realistic vision he'd ever had. In the dream, Raymond stood in his living room, which was empty. He somehow knew the entire house was empty and his wife and son were gone. As soon as he realized this, he screamed and ran out his door. On his doorstep stood the image of a glowing man of intense golden light, and its brightness was enough to blind Raymond momentarily. He never got a clear image of Christ's face through the sheen, but Raymond did feel an overwhelming wash of love that almost seemed to lull him into sleep. The Christ spread his arms and a scarlet light burned within his chest like a torch. A soothing male voice spoke to him, and Raymond could not tell if the mirage before him was even moving his lips. Still, he heard the message loud and clear, and even after processing it, after his carnal urge to scream and cry, the Christ gave him love. Laura and George have left this world, Raymond. You are here to contend with the opening of the seven seals, my revelation at the end of time and death. The voice told him without tone and without emotion. The rapture is here, and those you love and idolize have returned to my kingdom of heaven, now free from death. May you find my light to carry you home, but first you must die, and the dead will meet you. This is your last day. Until midnight of the second day, you will be judged. Before Raymond could plead for mercy, the Christ stepped backward into a curtain of light that swept him out of existence and Raymond out of his sleep. It was morning and Raymond woke up in bed, but Laura was missing from his side. His son George was gone as well, his bedroom door still closed. Laura's car was still in the garage and all her clothing was in place, leaving everything untouched from the day before. They were just gone, no note or dishes in the sink, only ruffled bed sheets. The phone was dead and there was no power in the house. Raymond could remember his dream, but his rational mind told him something horrible had happened to his family, never mind the vision. They were in the hospital, or something worse. Still dressed in his pajamas, Raymond hurried out of his house and into his truck. He set a course for the hospital, and that was precisely where he ended up, only in the back of the ambulance. He didn't make it far into town before the other driver blind swiped him into unconsciousness. Raymond got out of the hospital bed, pulling the plugs of oxygen from his nostrils. He went over to the window and felt a slight breeze as it fluttered across his lower back. He wore a white cotton hospital gown, open in the back. It was splattered with someone else's blood and had many red handprints on it. Come to think of it, there were bloody prints everywhere. Equipment was thrown aside, and a gurney lay broken and overturned in the corner. Blood dripped from the wall in frozen splatters. Raymond turned his attention back to the blinds and threw them open in one yank of his wrist. He was right. The sun wasn't shining. It was daylight, and the sun wasn't out. Dark rain clouds filled the sky in a broad paintbrush stroke. Raymond couldn't even see the mountains. The streets were completely empty, not a person to be seen, but there were a lot of cars. Some cars were overturned and still smoking. Some cars protruded from the front of nearby buildings like spears. The road was torn apart, brick and rock lining the streets like decoration. The street was torn down the middle with a spiderweb crack. Buildings had collapsed into piles of brick and ash, blanketing the entire street in a winter storm. Where's the help? Raymond thought. If this bad of an accident happened, then where is everyone? Raymond left the window with tear-strewn eyes and walked toward the closed door. He opened it slowly and entered the ghost town of a lobby. The front desk down the hall was unmanned, and he couldn't hear the normal orchestra of a hospital, of squeaking shoes or the hiss of medical equipment. There were no souls around. Raymond stepped out of his room, the cold linoleum stinging his bare feet to the point of numbness. The rooms along the hall were closed up tight. Trash, body limbs, clothing, gurneys, and more buckets of blood splattered the lobby. The fluorescent lights above him flickered and died for a minute. They shot back on and flickered again. Raymond tried for one of the room's door handles and found it locked. He tried another. Locked. Another. Locked. He stepped carefully the other way, toward the reception desk and toward a pair of double doors. He peeked over the front desk and found nothing. Pencils and papers were scattered around the floor and desk. Blood stained the carpet, and he found a shotgun that looked to be loaded. He thought about taking it for protection when he spotted the phone on the desk, which had been torn from its cradle. Raymond grabbed the cordless phone and checked that its battery pack was still intact. Then he checked for a dial tone. Hello? Hello, this line is no longer in service. Hello, this line is no longer in service. A mechanical female voice repeated over and over again. Yeah, I think I get the point. Hello, this line is no longer in service. Raymond set the phone down on the desk. He didn't even bother to turn it off. Then he threw open the swinging double doors. The lights above him snuffed out like a candle and they didn't flicker back on. Raymond stopped abruptly, chest heaving, breath thinning. He stood silent in the stunned darkness and could hear the phone off in the background. But it wasn't the woman's recording he was hearing. It was the piercing ee that a phone makes after it hasn't been turned off. Raymond went through the open doors and caught some natural sunlight, seeping through the wall-length window in front of him. Wind whipped at him from the open window and he shivered in his robe. Then Raymond fell against the swinging doors with surprise. All around him were the dead bodies of men and women. Some lay half in and out of the open elevators, and some lay decapitated on the floor in front of him. Raymond realized that he had stepped onto a floor stained with flowing blood. There were bullet holes all along the walls and in the elevator doors. Please, God, don't let the lights come back on. I don't want to see those bodies in the light. Please, God, no. The lights above him rebooted, and the elevator doors immediately started to open and close on their own. The stench reached Raymond's nostrils, and he winced in displeasure. It was the smell of burning hair and strong chemicals. Raymond realized that it wasn't just from the lobby he stood in, but the horrible smell was on the air, wafting in through the window. Raymond stepped shakily over the dead and stood by the opening and closing elevator doors. He chose one with the least amount of bullet holes and nudged the body of a man away from the door with his toes. He got inside and let the doors close around him. There were no bodies in there, but it was rife with holes and blood. It smelled like spoiled eggs, and it reminded Raymond of a leaky basement. He punched the ground floor button and the elevator trembled vigorously. Then it began to move steadily down the elevator shaft. Raymond closed his eyes, hoping to God that the power didn't go out again. Ding! The elevator door swung open and Raymond fled from the metal tomb and into an identical lobby, complete with the same devastation. Raymond gave the elevator doors a hurried glance. They shut with a snap. The elevator began its ascent back up the shaft. Silence. It was too silent. Raymond found himself running in circles through the maze-like corridors and hallways, searching endlessly for the exit. Whenever he came to an intersection of hallways, he'd frantically pick a passageway into a new set of corridors. The first floor was even worse than the fifth. Raymond noticed a lot of ash and burnt rubble from some kind of explosion. He passed by a few windows that were set high up on the walls. There was no way he could climb through them, though the glass was blown out. Raymond turned left toward the front desk, where he knew he'd find the exit. He followed a long, winding corridor and into the ER waiting room. He burst outside and ran away from the building, pushing his way past the onslaught of overturned cars and piles of burnt rubble. From behind him, he heard the doors of the hospital close. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He ran to the other side of the street, across a surface hot enough to scorch his bare feet. The parking lot was full, so he took the precautions of moving low behind the cars to hide him from outside eyes. He took a moment to catch his breath and look back at the hospital. It was now bathed in the shadow of the dark clouds, and like a blanket that had been pulled over his head, he felt his world go silent, left only with the ringing in his ears. The light resembled the cool moonlight hours, even though the watch on his wrist told him it was 2:30 in the afternoon. As Raymond should have expected, the rain pelted down from the clouds. All the windows in the hospital were drawn shut with blinds. Some windows were blown inwards, but still had the blinds fluttering neatly in the cool breeze. Raymond didn't wait for the blinds to be pulled back to reveal the pale faces inside. He couldn't help but think of all the closed doors on the fifth floor and what might be behind them. He allowed the cold rain to wash over his sore face and soothe his feet. From the drops off his beard, Raymond drank the rainwater greedily and savored the weight of his stomach again. He found the exit to the parking lot and jogged down the street, where he knew he would meet with an intersection of the 4 major roads in town. When he reached the intersection, where the bodies of the dead and the rubble choked all sides of the road, he charted his next course. He hoped that his dream was accurate and his family had safely escaped the nightmare. Maybe it wasn't too late for him to get out either. But if that meant his death, he would fight it to his last breath. If he could keep fighting, he would do so, though he understood one thing. Before he could surrender to the apocalypse at midnight, whatever that might be, he would return home one last time and make sure Laura or George weren't there. They might have found a safe way back to the house to wait for him. Only then could he go in peace. He decided to take Broadway from there to find another way around. His feet splashed in the quickly forming puddles. Rain poured down his face and neck. If this rain keeps up, there's bound to be a flood, Raymond thought. The thunder roared in agreement over his head, and the clouds broke open in a joyous snarl. Chapter 2. Raymond stopped at a restaurant that sat at the end of Boulder Avenue. Its windows were smashed in, leaving jagged pieces of glass to stand upright in the frame like teeth. The glass was stained with blood from the fingers that had forced it open. Raymond had stopped at the restaurant to find someone alive to help him, and to duck temporarily out of the rain. The window in front of him was large, stretching from the sidewalk to the top of the diner. Raymond stepped easily through the window and inside. He teetered into the diner and spied through the darkness. The restaurant was in tatters. The tables were thrown to opposite corners of the room and were either snapped into splinters or smeared with blood. There weren't any bodies Raymond could see, and he counted himself blessed. But the stink was there, just as it had been in the hospital. He stepped and winced in a hot scorch of pain that twisted itself up his thigh and into his groin. He looked down and suppressed the urge to scream. His bare foot had just stepped into a litter of broken shards. Raymond lifted up his leg in a cartoon reflex and stumbled backward. He hobbled into a crouched position to catch his breath, and his other foot crunched down on the same bed of glass. He bounced away from the glass and the window, and still managed to press on with his tiptoes. He slid into a seat at one of the open booths, which was relatively clean, and lifted his leg to inspect his foot. The damage proved only minor cuts on the surface, and he took his time in using his thumb and forefinger to pry the rogue glass shards from his flesh. In a matter of minutes he was free of pain, and he applied pressure with his hands. He took a look at his other foot and was thankful he'd be okay. He breathed a sigh of relief to be out of the rain. Outside, the thunder boomed and rain pelted in through the open window. Raymond stared at the excess rainwater, splashing and trickling over the floor in a hypnotic gurgle. He looked at the table attached to the booth, which was scattered with empty pretzels, beer nuts, and napkins. One napkin was hammered into the wood with a nail, and someone had scrawled something in chicken scratch on the faded surface. The skies opened in a smile, and those eyes I can't forget tore through the clouds. I know there will be no military or disaster relief. This was no disease. This was hell on earth. This is the apocalypse. I'm a God-fearing man, and the Lord has forsaken me, left me to die while those I love are free. There were red eyes in the sky looking at us, studying us. Raymond stopped reading and hung his head in silent prayer, ending the task with a simple gesture of the cross with his arms. Raymond tore the napkin from the tabletop and went to the door of the diner. There was a small calendar nestled on a nail with pictures of cheerleaders, and he dropped the calendar from the door to hang the napkin in its place. Whenever help decided to come, they'd see the note, though he knew the chances didn't even exist. Raymond jumped as the rain turned to sleet with large hailstones the size of marbles. They clicked and splattered heavily on the roof, as if knocking to get in. Raymond backed up into the shadows of the restaurant beyond the dining area. The lightning outside peeled across the clouds, reflecting through the glass in a whirlwind of blue fire. The window moved up and down on the wall as the world was shaking, an earthquake to bring the building down on his head, but Raymond steadied himself against the wall and breathed. He cowered against the farthest corner of the restaurant, which he didn't even care was marked with someone else's blood. Then he felt a chill run up his calf. He looked down idly, his peripherals still fixed on the toothless window. Nothing is the same anymore. Oh God, everything is alive and you're on the cliff over hell. He was standing in blood. Blood that was still flowing. Blood trickled through his toes like stream water, leaving red streaks on his feet. Raymond squirmed helplessly in place before he heard a stifled moan from the other corner, beneath an upset table and chairs. A black hump stirred there, and it was writhing in a sick spasm, just like a dying animal. Raymond stepped out of the red puddle and edged against the wall to get a closer look at the dark mass. Out of the darkness, two headlights of red fluorescent shined across the ceiling and walls. A man convulsed furiously in the far corner, hands beating at the hardwood floor. The red eyes rotated in his head like moving mechanical pieces. The cords and strands in his neck bulged. His lips curled over like hot wax, his teeth exposed and red. His nails scratched away at the wood floor, leaving deep grooves like a cat's claws. Raymond did not want to watch it, yet he couldn't take his eyes off the show. He pasted his back against the wall, his spine arching into the wallpaper. His head reared away from the scene, mouth open, but his eyes fixed. The man started to screech hoarsely, fist pounding at the earth like a ravenous ape. His eyes bulged with glassy exteriors, and Raymond was sure they were going to pop right out of his head. His mouth spilled more blood onto the floor. Raymond watched the man change in front of him from a corpse and into a blinking and breathing monster who snorted like a bull. It seemed to be weak and half asleep, rolling fitfully in its slumber, though its eyes were wide open. Its mouth opened and closed over a pink tongue, and the blue lips met and peeled apart. The arms became steady at his sides and then lifeless. His legs hardened into rigid staffs, and his head fell over onto his shoulders. His eyes closed and didn't open again. The body looked so peaceful there for a second, but Raymond knew the thing wasn't dead. It breathed raggedly. It snorted and whined. Raymond remembered what the Christ had told him in his dream. The dead will meet me. Is that how it is now? Raymond asked himself. To be punished with a perpetual death, sleepwalking and slumbering in a hell on earth? And will that be my midnight, to come back as one of them? He wondered when the thing's eyes would open again. to assemble this horrid new world? When would it regain its feet and exercise life back into its paralyzed arms and legs? Raymond didn't want to find out. He slid away from the wall and considered the tangle of chairs and overturned tables to his right. He heard the man groan and drag his nails across the floor. Raymond shifted his body weight to his knees and hid low to the ground behind the wreckage, peeking through a crack. Suddenly the man's head came into view as he stood upright. Raymond didn't want to look at the man's face, but he found it inevitable. The pupils in the man's red eyes shrank back into a camera's zoom. Then the man's hands went up to each side of his neck, and with one swift blurred movement, he cracked his neck first left and then right. Then he smiled, revealing sharp teeth. Raymond's body broke out in goose flesh. The creature sniffed the air, nostrils flaring crazily. Raymond ducked his head, and when he dared to look again, the man was gone, already stepping outside the window. He heard the man's shoes crunch with the glass. Raymond got up as quickly as he could and poked his head out the window and into the rain. Raymond saw a figure emerge from the fog at the end of the street, walking toward the restaurant, and it was covered with black blood. It didn't even look at the shops on either side as it strode casually by with a fixed intensity. More figures passed through the fog. The rain had begun to let up, reduced to a light drizzle. All the monsters were headed the same way, the way Raymond needed to go. They were all moving deeper into town. A humming woman in her 30s passed the window, and Raymond pressed himself against the wall, out of sight. The woman's head tilted to the side as she passed, and Raymond saw her red eyes strain to their corners as she spotted him. But she neither gave any indication that she cared, nor that she knew he was there. She tilted her head back and walked on down the street. She knew I was here. She saw me out of the corner of her eyes. Why didn't she attack me? Raymond asked himself. The dead will meet you, he heard inside his head. He edged closer, careful not to step on any of the glass. He got a better look at his travelers and saw they were all walking the same speed. He saw a mother and her toddler walking side by side, giving no indication that they were related at all. Their clothes were in tatters, burned and stained. The fog swept out of the town like a hand through a screen of smoke. Raymond could see the entire street, and it was streaming with people, elbow to elbow in a death march. There were at least 200 in view and still more to come, rolling in like a tide of joggers in a marathon line, although they were all in a discernible hurry. These people were familiar to Raymond. These were Raymond's neighbors and friends, now lost in their own shell of a body. Raymond gasped as he watched his son's 12-year-old friend strut across the sidewalk on the other end of the street. He hissed to himself, hobbling on the mangled mess of a leg. Raymond watched astonished as the undead marched through the rain, headed west. Some were smiling, others talking to themselves in dreamlike murmurs. Their gaze remained fixed forever forward. New lightning blew up and burned out with bright white flashes. Raymond jumped as the awaited thunder boomed forth, but the dead were not disturbed. More lightning illuminated the sky. Another man passed by the window so close that Raymond got a whiff of his rotting skin. He backed away from the window and made sure that he had good leeway to the back door if a problem should arise. Raymond tiptoed to the back door, hoping for an alleyway he could escape through. The door was unlocked and Raymond fell against it, revealing a loaded dock with a few dumpsters and a chain-link fence. He stepped into an ice-cold rain puddle and drew back suddenly. It felt quite cooling after the initial shock. He stepped again onto the gravel. Raymond took a deep breath and allowed the rain to wash over him, pasting his gown to his skin in an airtight seal. Raymond shuddered from the cold and wrapped his arms close to his chest to keep warm. In this way, he chose the straightest route home, through the litter-strewn streets and the alleys washed with blood. Even though he had to dodge from one alleyway to the other across a street corner or through an intersection, he remained alone. The flood of dead men and women had quickly vacated the streets, and Raymond hoped to do the same. Chapter 3. Although he remained alert, he did not bump into anyone else, living or dead. Well into the neighborhood streets, the world seemed a lot quieter, and there was less destruction on the streets. Many of the houses appeared ransacked and gutted, the doors standing open, and some had smoke wafting through their windows in vacuum drafts. With the horrors of downtown behind him, he approached his house, the second to last on the block, and suppressed tears at the sight of it. All the windows had been smashed and its furniture lay scattered and burned on the front lawn, as if an explosion had blasted them out of the windows. He poked through the remains of his own clothing and bedsheets, smoldering in the wet grass. Inside the house, he found a disaster of trash and refuse, and could smell gunpowder on the air. He called the name of his wife and son as he moved from room to room, finding nothing more than the remains of his life, smashed and ground into the shag carpet. He dared to walk up the stairs, stepping over the broken handrail and calling vainly the names of his family, whom he knew were far from earshot. That didn't prevent him from scouring each room, closing the doors after him, one by one. Back in the street outside his house, he looked up and down the block, wondering what he should do. He had no intention of going back into that house, not without Laura or George, and he sure as hell didn't want to stand in the street all night. With tears in his eyes, Raymond looked at his watch. It was 4 in the afternoon, leaving 8 more hours until the end, if he was to believe the prophecy in his dream. He gasped for breath, his throat constricting with choking sobs. Hyperventilating, he struggled to stay on his feet, and then cried out, doubling over with a splitting coughing fit. He heard voices yell out to him, and he looked up to see faces in the upstairs window of his neighbor's house. And they were smiling at him, laughing and yelling. He knew these people. They were calling for him to come inside. The front door had already opened, and hands were gesturing to him there. Gratefully, he limped inside, and the door was shut behind him, followed by a barricade of bookshelves and desks. The middle-aged woman standing before him was Margaret, a short, overweight woman who lived in the house with her husband and son. The young man pushing the barricades in place was her 19-year-old son, whose name escaped him at the moment. Raymond thanked them profusely, shivering in his surprisingly warm company. Looking around the house, he found that it stood in good shape, with the broken windows boarded up with wooden planks, giving the house a calm dimming effect, like crawling inside a cave. There were more people standing on the stairs, waiting for Raymond. There was Todd, the neighbor from across the street, and Jack from the next block. They were worse for wear, pale and skittish. Todd looked to be injured, his long sleeves ripped off and tight round his shoulders to stop the bleeding there. Whether it was helping or not was not clear by the red color on his makeshift bandage. They led him upstairs and into the attic, where Raymond had seen them peeking from the window. There was one other survivor laying down on a cot in the attic, an elderly woman with a white sheet pulled up to her chin. Her face was ashen white and tight, giving Raymond the impression of a corpse, but the woman's chest rose and fell with her shallow breathing. Raymond didn't know the woman personally, but he had seen her sitting on the porch of a house a few doors down. She lived with her daughter, whom Raymond didn't see in the attic with the rest. He counted heads. There were 5 in all. Jack handed Raymond a bundle of blankets and encouraged him to change out of his wet clothes. Raymond nodded his head, but only managed to drape the heavy comforter over his shoulders and sit down on the floor in a warm bundle. The other survivors watched him gravely. "Where did you come from?" Margaret asked. "The hospital," he managed to say. Todd passed him a bottle of water, still cold, and he drank from it gratefully, handing it back half-finished. "Did you see any people?" She seemed to be careful how she framed the question, and Raymond understood why. "None that I can really call people," he answered dryly. She nodded slowly, looking at Jack, who hung his head and sat down on the edge of the cot with the elderly woman. Margaret's son had just finished pushing a bureau over the trapdoor into the attic, which was enough to settle Raymond's nerves, not that he was afraid of anyone trying to get in. The monsters walking around in the streets didn't seem to be concerned with any activity besides their destination, and if there were bad men out there looting and hurting people, then Raymond had just missed them. It looked like a quarantine area out there, minutes after total evacuation. Raymond couldn't rule that out just yet. Perhaps the disaster was only central to his town, or his state, and nowhere else. Maybe help was on its way. "Laura? And George?" Margaret asked. Raymond shook his head. "They were missing this morning. I went out to find them, and I was rushed to the hospital. This is how I woke up." "And let me guess, you had a dream?" Tom said from the window. He turned his back on Raymond and looked out. "This is revelation, and we're all being punished." It occurred to Raymond at that moment that none of the people in the attic deserved to be in their situation. He knew Margaret well enough. She volunteered a lot of her time at the community center, organizing charity events for underprivileged kids. Her son was a valedictorian with a scholarship to a medical school next year, with a passion for helping people and saving lives. Todd was a counselor at the high school and helped teenagers cope with peer harassment and parental abuse. Jack was retired at the age of 50 and had 3 beautiful children, adopted from abusive households. Raymond couldn't help but notice he was alone. Without any of his family members by his side, Raymond would find out that each one of them had lost somebody to the rapture. Margaret had lost her husband, Todd his wife, Jack his wife and kids, and the elderly woman in the cot, named Mrs. Tinley, had lost her entire family, daughter and granddaughters alike. "But you, Ray," Todd said with disbelief, "I thought you were safe for sure with your family. I mean, you're the most charitable man in the neighborhood. I always see you at church, lending help wherever you can." "And why are we left while our families are gone?" Jack asked from the cot. He was honestly looking at Raymond for an answer, who could only look away and regard the far wall. "We're not bad people. It just doesn't make sense," Todd said. He placed his hand on the window and pressed his forehead against it. "What exactly did you dream?" Raymond asked. Margaret was the only one to meet his eyes, so he followed up his question with her. "Did we all see the same thing?" "Well, if you saw Christ, then we did too," she responded. "He told us we were to suffer the apocalypse while our families would be freed." "And how did this all start?" Raymond asked. "There was a lot of violence," Margaret said. "I tried not to look outside, and we held up in here. People were trying to make their escape, but the traffic made it impossible for people to leave," Margaret's son continued. He sat down next to Raymond, with his back against the wall. He stared up at the ceiling, in deep thought. "I heard the violence was worse in town. You must have seen it for yourself." Raymond could only nod. "What else did you see?" The boy looked Raymond in the eyes. I saw a dead man get up and walk away, Raymond said with a sick feeling in his stomach. There were hundreds of them, all walking toward the center of town. They were all dead, bleeding, and they had red eyes, Jack said. I saw them walking around outside. Once the looters quieted down, those zombies started taking to the streets, all walking in the same direction. Raymond sat up with interest. Where are they going? I've heard there's a bottomless pit in the center of the town, and they're all walking into it, like they're hypnotized or something, the kid explained. Where did you hear this? Raymond had to ask. There was someone in our group. He said he escaped the crowd downtown, where people were being trampled in the streets, just trying to run across the city limits. The kid stared at his hands, tugging on his own fingers. He said he saw the ground open up with fire. The dead were getting up off the street and walking in. What happened to him? He was badly hurt. Margaret hesitated to answer for her son, who looked grateful to accept the silence. He died of his wounds downstairs. We had to take him outside so he couldn't bother us in here. An hour later, the lawn was bare, and the sheet we rolled him in was empty. He just got up and joined the crowd. They don't even notice us, or don't even care, Todd said. I've stood here at this window and yelled down at them as they walk by. Usually they look up, just to see who it is. But they never move toward the house or look angry. They even smile before they look away and ignore me completely. What does that mean? That they don't attack us? Jack questioned. It might not mean anything, Todd replied with a shrug of his injured shoulder. Would we expect them to attack us? How should we know what to expect from actual zombies in the street? What if this is a test? To see who can survive the longest? Margaret's son asked suddenly, but only half the room had heard him. They all had questions to be answered. What if these dead people are possessed by demons? Margaret said. What do you think will happen at midnight? Todd asked. Why would God do this to us? What did we do? Raymond stood up and caught all of their eyes. Please, we need to think of a way out of this, Todd scoffed, turning around to face him. Where could we escape? We only have a few hours left. We could find help in the next town, Raymond sighed, aware that his words were falling upon deaf ears. What if there are other survivors out there? For God's sake, we have to try something. The fact that we have so little time makes it that much more important. We just can't sit around here and wait for the 4 horsemen. I'm not sure there are other survivors, but they won't be surviving for long. That came from Margaret's son. He did not sound happy with what he had just said, but he spoke it as though it was the truth. We can't leave Mrs. Tinley here, Margaret replied sadly. She motioned toward the sleeping woman in the cot. She's too weak to walk, and we can't just carry her out there. Raymond nodded that he understood and sat down again. The room seemed to settle with the new change of nervous energy, which acted like a ticking clock for their background. Raymond hung his head and waited, bracing his back against the wall. In this way, he fell asleep instantly. Chapter 4. Raymond woke up to the sound of scuffling feet and a crying woman. It was dark, only a shred of natural light from the moon outside the window, and he was able to read his watch. It was only a few minutes before midnight, and his neighborhood was just as quiet as before, except for the new excitement in the attic. He sat up straight to watch Margaret pulling her son back by the arms, begging him through her tears to stop. Jack and Todd had just entered the fray and were trying to calm them both down. The kid looked to be in the process of moving the piece of furniture from the trapdoor. Mom, I'm going out there, the kid screamed at Margaret, who only cried louder. There's nothing keeping me here, or you. Let me go out there and face whatever it is instead of hiding in this fucking attic. Raymond's right. Raymond looked at Mrs. Tinley, still breathing soundly in her bed. We can talk about this, Todd said. He grabbed for the kid, but he pushed Todd away into the wall. Don't touch me, he screamed. Raymond stood up, balancing himself against the wall and allowing the comforter to slip off his shoulders. Come on, he said. Let's stop this. The kid heaved open the door and Jack caught him in the headlock, struggling to pull him back. Margaret screeched and something heavy was overturned. Raymond was able to watch Margaret as she fell backward against a pile of boxes in the corner, landing in a dusty heap. Her son sprang after her, with Jack dragging him down like an anchor. In this way, they both fell over, smashing the kid face first into the hardwood floor. The entire attic shook and Raymond scrambled to pull Jack off. Raymond leaned forward and received a blind elbow in the face, and he scurried away into the wall, banging his head painfully. Todd hurried to his side, apologizing for hitting him accidentally. Somewhere Margaret was whining under her breath, calling her son's name, who was now unresponsive. Jack was able to carry the boy to a bundle of blankets on the floor and leave him there. God damn it, he cried, checking the boy's pulse. Margaret and Raymond stood by helplessly, holding their breaths. Is he alive? Raymond cried. Jack cursed again and Todd shoved him aside to inspect the boy's face, which was complete with a broken nose and some missing teeth. The boy struggled to breathe through the bubbles of blood through his mouth, and Todd quickly wiped his face clean and rolled him over on his side. What did you do? What did you do? Margaret screamed at Jack, pounding on his head with her open hands. He tried to crawl away from her, hands over his head. In the corner, Mrs. Tinley shot out of her sleep, eyes glassy and staring. She shrieked, and everyone grew silent. They watched as the room filled with bright light, sliding over the walls and ceiling like cool vapor, and easing them all into submissive positions, sitting on the floor with their muscles giving way. Here was the figure from their dreams, now standing before them, a foot above Mrs. Tenley's cot. The figure seemed to wear the light as his robes, shrouding himself in starlight, and the radiation from the sun, and the reflection of the moon. He spread his arms to envelop the room, and they felt the man's unconditional love for them, and only for them. Raymond realized that their group was the most important alliance left on the planet, and the last show on Earth was for them. But now it was all going to be fine. They would be delivered safely home to their waiting families. Mrs. Tenley shrieked again as she stared up at the man enshrouded in light, and her eyes rolled back in her head. The Christ figure reached down for her and managed to take her hand in his. Mrs. Tenley was drooling, foaming at the mouth, and her head lolled to the side. "Do not be afraid," the man said. "I have come to lead you far from here. You are the last survivors in your town, and you should not be here to witness the end." Margaret burst into tears of joy, rejoicing in thanks and bowing her head in prayer. Todd and Jack stared in awe at the figure from their knees, and Raymond couldn't even find his breath. He kept trying to peer through the glare and see Christ's features, his eyes or his mouth, the thin bridge of his nose or his dark locks of hair, but the light was too intense, and he found he couldn't look at it for more than a few seconds. "Take a hold of my robes now, while your son needs saving. I will take us into heaven, where you may be reunited with your loved ones." Margaret did not need to be asked twice. She took her son's hand, and then reached up to take a handful of Jesus' robes, which settled in her palm like a tail of mist. Todd and Jack reached out with both their hands and hung on to the figure's robes. Todd buried his face in the white light, and half of his body appeared to disappear as if dunking his head under water. "And you, Raymond, will you not take my hand and follow me home?" the voice asked him, speaking from inside his mind. "You take me home now?" Raymond said. "After all this, you come for us now?" The light intensified around the glowing man, and Raymond felt his eyes droop, muscles reduced to putty. "Will you refuse a reunion with your wife and child?" Christ asked. "Come now, Raymond, take my hand." He felt his stomach turn around inside him, the ground dropping out under his knees. Fingers touched his face, cold and scaly. They were Christ's hands, and they were wrapping around his throat. "You survived, Raymond," the voice said. "You came this far, but you cannot go any further. Time to sleep, and you'll be with your family when you wake." He was drifting down, down, and those fingers were tightening around his flesh, reeling him forward. Through a fog lens, he watched the figure extend several more arms from his chest, which clamped their incandescent claws across every other survivor's throat, even the old woman. They were all subdued, catatonic, and staring into the bright light. The arms retracted into the figure's robes, taking the survivors with it. "No!" Raymond screamed, and the figure started back, the light flickering around its body. "I demand for you to stop this!" The pressure around his neck loosened, and Raymond pulled back, landing on his feet. He shielded his eyes from the light with a heavy hand. "I demand that you show yourself, demon!" Raymond cried. "Show us your true form!" Then the light snuffed out in an instant, and Raymond found himself in a dimly lit attic, pooled with moonlight. The figure standing before him was no longer robed or holy. It was hunched over and smoking like a match. Raymond hiccuped in fear, his knees finally buckling under him. He slid down the wall behind him with a slight squeak. The figure stood upright and the face was revealed. It resembled a man with ink-black skin and red eyes, glowing like two red hot coals from his skull. His mouth was drawn back savagely to show off his decaying teeth. As if his body was a torch that had just been ignited, flames licked up his back and through his hair. Flames melted away his face, and Raymond could hear his flesh sizzle and smell it as it burned. His hair wasn't affected by the fire. His black locks swung along his shoulders in a mesmerizing fashion, like there was a breeze tickling his back. The eyes seemed to split like eggshells, and they were filled with electricity. They shone brightly with a magnificent red light, pulsing like diodes in the darkness. Blood oozed from his burns in his forehead, yet his smile never faltered. The fire licked around his robes, but his clothing did not burn like his skin. He wasn't actually on fire. He had created the flames somehow, produced them like natural sweat. His nose creased down sharply and his cheeks became rugged desert landscapes. Large black shadows spawned from the ends of his eyes, his teeth chipping away from their lifeless black gums. The flames on his back grew brighter and bigger as he changed. His serpent tongue flicked out between his charred lips, black and rotting with green mold. The creature's eyes dug into Raymond's skull and prodded at his thoughts with a fire poker of immense heat. Raymond tried to scream, but the pain in his body was unbearable. Raymond could hear millions of voices hissing in his mind, all the voices of the dead, and they were happy he was dying. Finally dying. The figure's eyes grew as big as pulsing suns, each with tiny pupils that shrank and expanded randomly. Raymond's knees caved in and he fell onto his back. The demon's face cracked like a piece of porcelain as his mouth opened wide. The eyes were swimming with sparks of color, all the colors imaginable. Raymond cried out savagely inside his mind, but the voices only screamed back in return. He could hear the choir of the damned, a million unholy voices laughing within his mind, prodding and poking. The demon screamed with pain as fire consumed his entire body. His eyes burned like supernova suns. He exploded in a shower of sparks, and Raymond fell over on his side, his mind suddenly clear and light. Sleep fell upon him in a wave, and he rode it out to the sea. Epilogue. Once every month, Raymond, Todd, Jack, Mrs. Tinley, Margaret, and her son met in the attic of Margaret's house to gather on the floor and pray as a group. They thought it was only right, because it was important for them to remember the day the earth almost ended, while everyone else had forgotten. It was as if the day had never happened, even though the memory of it was still fresh in their minds. The 6 of them had been the only ones to experience the apocalypse. The next morning they woke up in their beds with their families, with their wives, husbands, and their children. The town hadn't been destroyed and was still in one piece. The dead were not walking the streets, and a bottomless pit was yet to be formed at the center of town, and they were the only ones who had memory of that horrible day, and their final altercation with the demon in the attic. They were all blessed with nightmares, though they still had a place in reality. Each of them could recall with expert clarity what happened that day, up until the Christ figure appeared before them in a cast of light. Raymond had to tell them the rest of the story, where the being had shown its true form. Apparently Raymond had defeated the creature in that last minute, resetting the doomsday clock back to 0. But was it still counting? Though they wanted to believe they had shared the same dream for some inexplicable reason, they still held an enormous responsibility for the safety of their loved ones and the town. Perhaps they had seen into the future somehow, at the inevitable scene to come, and they could prevent it. Or perhaps they had been the participants in a cruel virtual reality created by the demon for its own enjoyment. What remained certain was the realization they carried with them every night they went to sleep, kissing their partners goodnight as if for the last time. It was the realization that they shouldn't jump to trust anyone, just because he can appear before them in a shaft of white light. Every night Raymond prayed to meet the demon again in his dreams, just so he could refuse him one more time and discard him into the darkest pit of his own unconscious. Raymond had braved the apocalypse and survived. Although he hadn't quite made it to midnight, he wondered what happened after that. He wondered what it would be like to step off the cliff into a bottomless pit and fall forever. Even though the fantasy gave him a dark thrill in his stomach, it was better he didn't find out.